What if one of history's most famous assassinations never happened? A day that changed the course of Western civilization forever. But imagine for a moment that Caesar saw it coming. Imagine the conspirators' daggers missing their mark. What if Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, had lived to see another day? Would Rome's republican system have collapsed anyway? Would the mighty Roman Empire have expanded even further? Would we still see Roman influence in our world today? The answer might shock you, and it's far more complex than you might think. When Caesar fell to those 23 stab wounds on the Senate floor, Rome stood at a crossroads. But here's what most people don't realize. The Republic was already dying long before Caesar's blood stained the marble. By 44 BCE, Rome had endured decades of civil wars, political corruption, and military strongmen seizing power. The traditional republican system was crumbling under its own weight. Caesar wasn't the cause of Rome's transformation. He was its symptom. But had Caesar lived, his immediate plans were crystal clear. Within days of his assassination, he was scheduled to leave Rome for a massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. Caesar had already appointed officials to govern in his absence for the next 3 years. That's how long he expected to be gone. And here's the twist. This eastern campaign wasn't just about conquest. It was about solidifying his power and keeping potential rivals occupied with military glory rather than political ambition. With no assassination, Caesar would have marched east with 16 legions. That's roughly 80,000 battle-hardened Roman soldiers. His planned route would have taken him through modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and possibly as far as Iran. Had he succeeded, Rome's eastern frontier would have extended hundreds of miles further, potentially incorporating regions that Rome historically struggled to control. But military conquest was just part of Caesar's vision. The man was an administrative genius. In the months before his death, he had already begun unprecedented reforms, reforming the tax system, expanding citizenship rights, establishing colonies for veterans, and even fixing the calendar. The Julian calendar, with its 365 days and leap years, is the direct ancestor of our modern calendar. Had he lived another decade, these reforms would have transformed Rome's governance from top to bottom. Now, many historians believe Caesar was planning to become king in all but name. But here's where it gets interesting. Caesar was 55 when he died. He wasn't young, he had epilepsy. He might have ruled another 10, maybe 15 years at most. And then what? Caesar had only one legitimate child, his daughter Julia, who had already died. His only known biological son was Caesarion, his child with Cleopatra, who was just 3 years old when Caesar was killed. Instead, Caesar had adopted his grandnephew Octavian as his heir. If Caesar had lived, would Octavian still have inherited his power? Or would Caesarion, the son of Caesar and Cleopatra, have been groomed for leadership? Imagine a half-Egyptian ruler at the head of the Roman world. Talk about a cultural shift. But what about Rome's territorial expansion? Without the chaos of civil war that followed Caesar's death, Rome might have secured its eastern frontier against Parthia much earlier. Caesar had also shown interest in conquering Germania, which is modern-day Germany. He had already subdued Gaul, that's France, and made 2 expeditions to Britain. Had he lived to complete these northern conquests, Latin language and Roman customs might have taken deeper root in northern Europe. German might never have emerged as a distinct language family. The cultural map of Europe would be unrecognizable. The most fascinating what-if centers on Rome's institutions. Would Caesar have preserved the Senate and Republican offices while emptying them of real power? Exactly what Augustus eventually did? Or would he have taken a different approach? Caesar had been named dictator for life, an unprecedented and technically illegal position in the Roman system. But here's something few people realize. Caesar actually increased the size of the Senate from 600 to 900 members, diluting the power of the old aristocratic families by including provincial elites and even former enemies. He wasn't just centralizing power, he was reshaping the entire Roman political class. Had he lived longer, this transformation would have continued, potentially creating a more stable empire with broader representation from the provinces. Rome might have avoided some of the traumatic civil wars that plagued its later history. Now let's talk about religion. The most profound long-term change that might have happened without Caesar's assassination relates to Christianity. Augustus, Caesar's heir, established the foundation of the Roman Empire that would later embrace Christianity under Constantine. But what if Caesar had lived another 15 years? The political and religious landscape of Judea would have been completely different during the time when Jesus was born. Would Christianity still have emerged in the same form? Would it have spread throughout the Roman world in the same way? Here's the most mind-blowing possibility. Without Caesar's assassination, the concept of imperial cult worship might have developed differently. Caesar was deified after his death, becoming a god in the Roman pantheon. This set a precedent for later emperor worship. Had he lived longer, establishing his divine status while alive, the entire religious framework of Rome might have evolved differently, potentially creating a stronger imperial cult that could have resisted the later spread of Christianity. But before we get too carried away with the idea of an eternal Rome dominating the world, we need to consider Rome's fundamental weaknesses. Even with Caesar alive, Rome faced immense challenges, managing a vast territory with primitive communication, balancing the interests of different regions and social classes, and defending thousands of miles of borders against determined enemies. The truth is, Rome's eventual decline wasn't primarily about leadership. It was about structural weaknesses: economic instability, over-reliance on slave labor, military overextension, and environmental degradation. Caesar might have delayed these problems, but solving them entirely? That's another question. So, would Rome still rule the world if Caesar had lived? No empire lasts forever. Rome would have eventually fallen, whether in the 5th century as it did in our timeline, or perhaps a century or two later with stronger foundations. But the world we live in today would be profoundly different. Our laws, languages, borders, and perhaps even our religions would reflect an alternate path of history, all hinging on whether a group of senators decided to draw their daggers on that fateful March day. History pivots on such moments. A few minutes, a few daggers, a few men. Caesar's last words were reportedly, "You too, my child?" as he recognized his friend Brutus among the assassins. In our alternative timeline, those words were never spoken, and in their absence, the entire future of Western civilization would have been rewritten. The most powerful lesson from this historical what if isn't about Caesar at all. It's about us. How fragile the path of history truly is, and how differently our world might have unfolded if just one famous day had gone another way.